Hello everybody, my name is Mavashev. I'm a CTO of Nastel Technologies, and my topic today is about user experience. And I decided specifically to focus on the quality of user experience. Now, does anybody actually have a really good definition of what a quality is? I mean, we talk about quality all the time, and we typically when we engage, especially like with applications, and pretty much anything we buy or use, we make these types of judgments in terms of whether something is a high quality or not. Specifically, like if we take a streaming video as an example, we define quality typically by the definition, resolution, refresh rate. So there's all kinds of, I guess, metrics you could use to define quality. Now, I'm going to have to kind of narrow the topic a little bit and talk really specifically around applications. They could be mobile, and web applications, but basically digital interactions. And most of our interactions today are, in fact, digital, right? I mean, we're mostly on our phones, whether it's Facebook, Snapchat, whatever, Twitter, all kinds of web applications. We use these mobile apps, and if you're in the enterprise, they don't have to be customer-facing apps. They could be server-side apps that are doing all kinds of processing, whether it's payments, claims, orders. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to the customer experience. And one good way to define quality, in my view, and there's actually a definition, is basically a standard by which you define and compare to other things, right? So again, if you see a video and it's a 720, versus 1024, you're going to say, well, this video is a higher quality, right? And in some cases, it's fairly kind of easy to define. In other cases, it's not. Now, I look, when people ask me what is a high quality experience, I typically say, well, the quality is really about being, attentive to detail. It's all a bit about attention to detail, right? Sometimes when you look at the physical thing, you look at how much the author or the artist put effort into, whether it's a sculpture or an art to make this happen, and it's all attention to detail. And when we look at digital apps, I think a lot of it does actually have to do with attention to detail. Now, how do we define what detail is? So, when I look at and try to break down what a user experience is, I look at and break it down into different dimensions. And again, depending what kind of applications you're dealing with, you can break it down into design, function, performance, and stickiness. Now, some of these terms are, again, also kind of very broad, and I think we have some intuitiveness as to what they mean, but I'll give you an example. So, for example, design. Well, design could be ease of use, aesthetics, things like even, how the buttons look and how certain things, what color schemes, right? So all of this talks about design. Performance, a lot of folks associate performance with, how long do things take? But it doesn't have to be, right? So for example, we say, when we try to buy something or click on something, does it take 2 milliseconds or does it take 30 seconds? There's a big difference. Now, when you're dealing with the customer-facing applications, performance could be how well the features are actually laid out. How long does it take you from, to accomplish a particular task? It has nothing to do necessarily with the response time of a website. And then function, obviously, does it do what you want it to do? If the application is completely well designed, but it really doesn't do much, the quality of experience is probably not going to be that good. And then stickiness is one of those things. It's kind of like somewhat it's a function of, after all of this stuff, do you want to come back and use the application? And it's a very personal and kind of biased experience, because if you're using the application and using it for a very long time, it's a kind of a stick app. You constantly use it, you come back and you make use of it. And in fact, I've seen some applications that are not very well designed, potentially may not even be very well performant, but actually be quite sticky, right? So if you take all of this into account, you can actually gauge the quality of user experience. Now what's interesting is it's almost like a fractal in a sense. Each of these can be broken down into its own areas, meaning design is in itself is another one of these triangles. And then the function is another one of triangles. And you can go and repeat and kind of repeat this whole process almost indefinitely. And that's why you see that the quality is typically is not something you just make happen. It's usually as a consequence of a long process, an iterative approach to constantly figure out what's the best design, how do we make that happen, how do we make this perform better, what kind of functions should we include, what functions we shouldn't include, and then how do we make the application stickier, right? So I look at it as almost like a fractal that you constantly iterate over and over and over, and you break it down into all of these pieces. Now, what's also interesting is depending what kind of applications you develop or use, it doesn't necessarily have to be equal weight in each of these areas. So, for example, if I'm a mobile app that doesn't really make too many requests and is completely on my phone, I can completely focus on design, right, without really paying much attention to potentially like performance as a response time element of that. So it's not so much, so you can actually decide which of these elements you want to focus on. It really depends on the kind of application you're dealing with. So an example, if you're a server-side application, let's say you make payments, a lot of it is actually focused on function and performance. You don't really care about the design much, although design you can look at it like how good your API is designed, right? That's one of the things that you could look at as a defining moment of what is the quality means. And for example, for developers, and I don't know who's here as a developer, you could look at an API and actually say, that's a very well-designed API because you look at how the functions are, what are the arguments, and how's the model done. And you could look that there's a lot of thought and process that was actually spent on designing something that is not even customer-facing. So break it down into these kind of major functional areas. As we look at a model for perfect user engagement, one of the things, for example, I do is that I actually take it and break it down almost like a radar graph. So one of the things is you can actually create almost like a model and create a scoring mechanism. So if you have an application that's very basic, and again, depending on what application you're dealing with, this is a basic one. You register, you do a logon, you do a search, and then let's say you buy. And it's a very basic kind of model that a lot of applications today actually structured the way they're structured. And you kind of create that radar graph where you measure each of these elements, whether it's a stickiness, function, design, and performance, and you lay down on the radar graph. Now here's an example. The perfect user experience in this particular situation is the one that covers the most area. So if you have all of these angles covering the most area, you've achieved, in a sense, the greatest user experience. And the way I could say that is because if, for example, stickiness, if I have an expanded triangle, or the expanded actually a rectangle kind of completely to cover that whole area, what it means is when people come to my application and use my application, they are basically satisfied on all of these basic dimensions, right? And you can actually have a scientific approach to this model. It's not like you can go and say, well, how do we improve customer experience? Well, maybe we should do this, and maybe we should do that. Well, it's all kind of trial and error, right? It's not very scientific. But in this case, you can actually come up with a fairly methodical way of improving customer experience. So let's say you have an application release 1, 2, 3, and you release application 2. You can actually, based on these radar graphs, compare one and another, and you say, hey, have I improved my customer experience, or have I actually degraded in certain areas? And the difference in the area is where you've actually improved or degraded. So that becomes a very key instrument and measuring technique to figure out what your application is doing and how do you measure that and map it to the customer experience. So as we go into the measurement, there are a couple of things that we need to consider. So for example, when you look at the funnel of the application engagement, so let's say you go and you register the application, you completely get out. Now, that means there's a problem in that phase of the engagement. And look at the funnel below. So we had an application register, log on, search, and buy. So in this case, what we mean here is that 5% of people who come in actually buy the product. Now, that depends, again, on what your expectations are. You could say, well, 5% is good, or maybe 5% is bad. And as you increase these percentages, you have to fundamentally increase the user experience, right? So it's almost like by increasing the percentages, you basically saying, hey, the users as they come in feel more comfortable, and their experience has to be a quality experience for them to in fact buy from or use and actually buy from my application. So if 100 people actually downloaded, or let's say out of 100 people, 50% actually registered, 45% logged on, but only 15% searched for something and only 5% bought. In this particular example, I may want to actually spend a lot of my effort on the search and the buy aspect of my application to figure out what are the things that I need to optimize to increase those steps, right? And typical things that you measure fall into multiple different areas. One is, and this is something that's, a lot of times when we talk about user experience, not sure why this keeps jumping, is people really focus a lot around performance, right? They say, well, how long does this take? And if the performance is good, we think that the experience is great. Now, I'll give you an example where this is completely false. Now, imagine you click on something, it takes 2 milliseconds, but it absolutely does nothing for you. Well, the experience is completely horrible, yet performance is great. So when we look at, for example, user-facing types of things that you have to measure, you have to look at every step of the engagement, but you also look at, for example, things like how long does it actually take to go from step to step. So for example, I actually had a situation where I did a web meeting, and I had really difficult time to find out how to invite individuals into the meeting. And what's interesting was that they put a button right in the front of the screen that says start, and a small little icon somewhere in the corner, almost grayed out, that says invite other people. I could not find on that application that there was actually an invite, even though it was there, until somebody pointed to me. Now, functionally, the app was working, but I spent almost 10 minutes trying to figure out how to invite somebody into the meeting. And when I tried to analyze why that is so, what was interesting, it more or less has to do with biology and maybe how people focus on certain things. They actually put a green button right in the middle of the screen, so all my attention kind of zeroed in. And I completely lost focus on what was around in the periphery of the screen. So here's an interesting example. So I thought, well, how would you tackle this situation? How would that user how would the company on the other end that thought that they're providing with this application, how would they detect it that I had a problem? And I said, well, how would I do it? Well, one of the things I would do is I would look at my engagement. So let's say when I created this meeting and when I went into this application, how long did I actually try to find something? What was the time between me creating the meeting and actually inviting? Because that's the next logical step, is you have to invite somebody. Otherwise, what's the point of the meeting? So had they measured that and seen that I actually spent, let's say, 1 or 2 minutes trying to find it, they could have said, hey, there's a problem with a bunch of users. They can't find somebody to invite folks, and it takes too long. And if we can do that, then we can optimize them and say, how do we reduce it by reorganizing this training? This is just an example of how measuring user engagement could be very important. Now, for the server side, it's obviously, other metrics that you can use, and most of it is focused on server side, like latency and performance. And one of the things I use is, for example, clicks and steps between the clicks. So, for example, you can go through all of these stages in the funnel, but how many clicks and how many interactions do you have have to actually do in order to do that. An example, from registration to log on to search to buy. Is it 30 clicks? Is it 5 clicks? Is it 10 interactions? Is it 100 interactions? The less interactions, typically, the better, right? And then the bottom line metric, again, in most of the apps, is what is the goal? In many applications, it has to do with revenue, right? So if all of this is great, but your revenue is suboptimal, then you basically fail in a sense, right? And again, it depends on what that goal is. Now, I put revenue here. It doesn't have to be revenue. It could be maybe your application just deals with registration. That's all that's really capturing. But I put revenue here because that's one of the most common and important things to deal with. Now, the server side, a lot of it has to do with decomposing your latency. Latency is one of those big things. Even if you know how long things take, and a lot of times you deal with, let's say, synthetic transactions when you run and you think, oh, I'm capturing performance. Well, you're not really capturing performance of an end user, you're capturing performance of a robot that running this transaction. That's what you're capturing. It gives you some metrics, but again, you don't really know exactly why it takes 5 seconds. Can you break that 5 seconds into individual pieces and figure out what you need to do to actually improve it? And then the last latency, or the last mile, the last kind of point of it is that you don't have really control over the whole environment. So you have an application that's, let's say, on your phone, or a web application, you can control that. You can control what's available on the server side, but you don't really control what's in between. So what I call, let's say, last mile connectivity. However, it does, in many cases, impact your user experience, right? So if I have an application, again, it doesn't matter what that is, and I can't do what I need to do, and it happens to be because of a service provider, that's still on you, right? That still impacts your bottom line. So what can you do about this? Well, if you can measure what that time is, you can then potentially maybe reroute traffic. Maybe you can provide some kind of feedback back into the user to help them avoid that situation. I had an example, for example, myself with YouTube. So I was watching a video, and then I lost the connectivity. Well, it told me, you lost the connectivity, would you like to watch some of your downloaded videos? Well, you see, they gave me an alternative path. I didn't have to say, well, what's wrong with it? What can I do about it? They detected that there was a problem. So again, as a proactive engagement with the user, they were able to detect it and then provide me with an alternative. So again, an example of how you can proactively kind of manage even in light of the situations where you have completely no control. So one of the techniques, and again, when we look at that, I talk about user engagement. And what that means is you have to be able to capture it. So one of the basic things in order to improve customer experience is you actually have to start capturing user interactions. Now, these user interactions has to do with your web application, mobile application, server-side application. Doesn't really matter what that is, but you have to start capturing that engagement. And going forward, there's different ways, obviously, to do it. So we take the digital app, and again, doesn't matter what that is, mobile, web, doesn't matter. And then you also take all of the server-side pieces that enable that application. And in some cases, it could be as simple as a web service call. In other cases, it could be a lot more complex, where you have middleware application servers and the rest of the microservices, containers, and a fairly complex interaction, other cloud services that you may engage. So the idea is to capture the whole interaction from beginning to end. Literally from a swipe if it's a mobile application, a swipe on the phone, all the way down to what is the result of that interaction all the way down and back. And to do that, there's a variety of different techniques to do that. Now, for example, on mobile apps, you can actually embed some of the code directly into the application. On the web applications, you can actually do insertion, automatic injection of the code directly into your web app. And obviously, on the server side, there's a variety of different techniques. Again, it depends on what you have in your application, what that landscape looks like. But you can actually observe, as the person swipes and clicks, what is that impact of that interaction across the whole chain and then back. So in this particular example, imagine as you click, you interact, you actually intercept a call or a swipe, a button click, whatever that may be, an HTTP request down to the application server, maybe a database call, a JMS call, and all the way down. And again, if you're running a fairly complex backbone in the background, even including the mainframes, it could potentially be intercepting actually a whole set of a chain of events all the way down to the mainframe and back. And that's how actually partly what happens when you don't have this visibility is the customer calls or something, or you have a degraded performance on the application, and then you actually going out and trying to hunt for why that is. And that's a long process. And in many cases, the customer, and today, as we know, we're kind of have attention problems, especially because we've been spoiled by all of this, fast applications. So essentially, our attention span is probably within a few seconds. They say, I think the research shows that if you're more than, I'd say, 15 or 30 seconds, that people basically abandon. They don't care anymore. And imagine if you're like an Amazon site or whatever, and then you try to buy something and you can't, you just go somewhere else. And you just do, you buy from somebody else. And I actually remember how I actually came across it, for example, the first time Google is somebody says, well, searches are too long. Why don't you go, try Google? I'm like, what's Google? I typed in, and it was just one, and that was like, if you think about it, it was a very clean design. I mean, they made it something very simple, but it did only one thing, and it did it very well. So when I did a search, I got it came back within seconds versus, or actually within milliseconds, versus other searches was too long. So that was it, right? That was for me an experience that was actually one of the examples of a great user experience. But if you think about it, what did it take for them to actually achieve it? It's all of that infrastructure and back. Somebody had to think about what happens when you click a search, and what happens with all these interactions, and what happens with all of the databases and data centers, and how does it all relate back to something that is as simple as clicking a button. All of these complexities have to be taken into account for this something simple to occur. So as we kind of mapping this, and again, I try to make some of these interactions sort of visualize. And again, so imagine when you click or do something, whether it's a web application, server side, it doesn't really matter. This is really what happens, and this is just the actual examples from real environments where and again, it also depends who you are in the organization. So you're on the other side, you're providing the app, and then somebody doesn't interact with your environment, that has a whole set of kind of ripple effects, right? It hits different servers, web servers, different applications, different data centers, you have different geographies involved. So somebody really has to look at this from a central point and say, hey, what kind of experience am I providing, for example, folks in New York versus, for example, Nevada versus California, or people coming in from, let's say, from overseas. And if we have a disparity of the user engagement, what should I do about this? Where do I look? And again, this is just as an example of the complexities of something that is as simple as a mouse click. Going forward, then if you start to actually decomposing it further, you start looking at more deeper engagement. Because again, as you start understanding of what that process looks like, it's actually, think of it as all kinds of asynchronous events occurring at different times. So the complexity of it is actually, it's very complex because you have to take all of these events, like a mouse click, a swipe, an HTTP request, a database call, and you have to actually put it all together into something that gives you a clearer picture of what the engagement looks like. Now, not only do you want to measure that engagement, you also want to look at obviously things like error rates, are there any problems? It's not just about like what what that interaction looks like, but what are the underlying metrics behind it. So for example, latency is one such metric. But it doesn't have to be, so one example is like, what features in your applications do you actually use? Maybe there's some features that are completely useless. Maybe nobody actually clicks on that button. You have to actually look at that workflow and see what that workflow is and why that is so. So these interactions could get quite complex. And then obviously the example here is if you are obviously in charge of that application environment, you then should be able to click into that and say, well, why do I have a problem? And then go and figure out what's going on behind the scenes.